Renji Kurose had spent years watching experienced executives revise their opinions the moment they learned his surname. Dr. Simone Mercer did the opposite. She looked at the restructuring plan he had placed in front of her, circled 3 distribution hubs in red, and told him he had designed an efficient way for one disloyal man to cripple half his network. 48 hours later, a regional director tried exactly that. If you're listening from somewhere in the world, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. 3 days earlier, Renji had entered Shinsei University, believing the semester was an inconvenience. The Kurose Council had called it preparation. He called it theater. For 2 generations, the Kurose organization had learned to hide its oldest businesses behind newer ones. Warehouses became logistics subsidiaries. Protection arrangements became private security contracts. Construction money passed through firms whose annual reports looked clean enough to survive casual scrutiny. That transformation had made the organization richer. It had also made leadership more complicated. When a financial investigation froze accounts connected to several Kurose companies, the Succession Council delayed Renji's confirmation as chairman. They wanted proof that the next leader understood governance, regulatory exposure, and the risks created by legitimate corporate expansion. Professor Masato Ishida offered the solution. 1 semester at Shinsei's executive governance program. Renji had initially refused. Then, one of the oldest council members had asked him a question he could not dismiss. If the organization now survives through companies, why should its leader know less about companies than the people running them? So Renji enrolled. Ishida personally arranged the placement. That should have made things easier. Instead, Renji found himself in a seminar room with 22 senior executives and a professor who did not seem impressed by any of them. Dr. Simone Mercer was 36 Black British and recently appointed to Shinsei's faculty after several years advising firms on behavioral economics and corporate fraud. Renji knew those facts because one of his assistants had prepared a profile. He had barely read it. He assumed the university had selected her because she was academically fashionable, internationally marketable, and unlikely to challenge the political arrangement behind his enrollment. That assumption lasted 18 minutes. Simone began the seminar by projecting a failed acquisition model onto the screen. She did not ask who had the most experience. She asked which assumption in the model would become dangerous if everyone in the organization believed it at the same time. Several executives gave answers about leverage ratios. One mentioned currency exposure. Renji said nothing. Simone called on him anyway. Mr. Kurose. He looked up from the printed material. What would fail first, the supplier network? Why too many dependencies routed through one intermediary? She studied him briefly, then nodded. Good. So, you do read? A few people smiled. Renji did not. He was not offended. He was irritated by the fact that she had correctly identified why he had remained silent. At the end of class, Ishida entered through the side door. His attention moved immediately to Renji. Everything satisfactory. The question sounded ordinary. It was not. 2 administrators stopped moving. Simone noticed them. Renji noticed that she noticed. Yes, he said. Ishida seemed relieved. Simone closed her laptop. I'll decide that after I see his work. Ishida gave a short laugh, as though she had made a joke. Renji saw the problem immediately. He had assumed Ishida had explained the arrangement. Clearly, he had not. The first major assignment required each participant to submit a restructuring proposal based on a company they understood well. Renji used Kurose Maritime Group. He removed identifying details from several divisions, but kept the operational logic intact. It was not an academic exercise. The restructuring had already been drafted for implementation. 3 warehouses would be consolidated. 2 regional offices would lose independent control over transport allocation. Procurement would be centralized. The changes would save millions every quarter. His own advisors had approved them. When Renji presented the model, the room responded as expected. Efficient, aggressive, clean. Simone stood beside the projection and read the flow diagram without speaking. Then she picked up a red pen. She circled 3 hubs on Renji's printed copy. Who controls these regional directors? 1 each? Yes. Independent authority within limits. She tapped the first circle. Then, this structure is unstable. Renji looked at the diagram. No, it removes duplication, it removes redundancy. That is the point. Redundancy is expensive until betrayal becomes more expensive. Several people stopped taking notes. Renji leaned back. Simone continued. You've concentrated routing permissions, inventory visibility, and emergency reassignment authority into fewer hands. If one regional director becomes hostile, compromised, or simply afraid that person doesn't need to destroy the network. She moved the pen between the 3 circles. He only needs to make the rest of it hesitate. Renji knew the real control systems. She did not. The safeguards she could not see changed the analysis. You're assuming too much authority sits at the regional level. I'm assuming the model you submitted is accurate. It is. Then either the structure is vulnerable or your diagram is dishonest. That earned a few uncomfortable looks. Renji closed the folder. You teach from models. Simone met his stare. And you seem very certain. Reality will respect yours. He left the room without answering. That evening, he authorized the restructuring. It was not spite. He had spent 4 months building it. His finance team supported it. His logistics advisors supported it. A professor who had seen 12 pages of sanitized data did not outweigh the people who understood the actual organization. The first call came the following afternoon. A regional director named Toma had stopped responding to internal requests. By evening, 2 shipping schedules had been altered. Then, temporary access restrictions appeared across systems Toma supervised. Nothing catastrophic happened. That made the disruption worse. Containers stalled instead of disappearing. Drivers waited for revised instructions. Managers requested approvals that had previously been automatic. Every safeguard still existed. They simply required coordination. The network hesitated. Renji spent most of the night containing it. Toma had apparently learned that an internal review was approaching and decided to protect himself before anyone could examine contracts connected to his office. He had not brought the Kurose logistics structure down. He had demonstrated that he could slow it enough to extract concessions. Exactly as Simone had predicted. By dawn, Renji had restored operational control. The cost was measurable. Delayed shipments, emergency rerouting fees, 2 commercial clients demanding explanations, and 1 uncomfortable question. How had Simone seen the weakness so quickly? The next seminar began at 9. Renji arrived at 8:47. His usual seat was available in the back row. He walked past it. Simone was organizing papers at the front when he sat in the first row. She glanced at him. No smile. No comment. She began class. Halfway through the session, she returned the restructuring assignments. Renji's paper landed on his desk covered in restrained red notation. 3 circles remained around the same distribution hubs. Beside 1 transaction model, she had marked 3 tiny inconsistencies in the data. Not the large numbers. Not the obvious risks. Small deviations. At the bottom of the page, she had written 1 sentence. Never remove an outlier simply because it ruins the pattern you expected to find. After class, Renji stayed behind. Simone gathered the remaining papers. You were right about the regional vulnerability, he said. She looked at him more carefully now. You tested it in a manner of speaking. That sounds expensive. It was. That nearly produced a smile. Nearly. Renji placed the paper on her desk and pointed to the 3 small marks. Why these Simone looked down. For the first time since he had met her, she took slightly too long to answer. They repeat. In what? The logic behind the model. That isn't what I asked. No. She closed the folder. Then she asked him something that had nothing to do with the assignment. Who can alter archived transaction structures after final approval? Renji did not answer. Very few people outside Kurose Holdings even knew those historical models were preserved. Fewer still would think to ask who could modify them. Simone seemed to realize she had pushed too far. She stepped back into professional distance. It matters in fraud analysis. Renji picked up his paper. Perhaps that was true. But on the drive back to Kurose headquarters, he opened the real logistics files on the secure tablet beside him. He found the corresponding historical model. Then the first irregularity. Then the second. The third sat exactly where Simone had marked it on a document that supposedly contained no confidential operational detail. Renji stared at the screen for several seconds. The professor had already proved that his restructuring could fail. That problem was manageable. This one was not, because Simone Mercer had recognized fingerprints inside a system she was never supposed to know existed. Renji did not ask Simone about the historical irregularities the next morning. He watched instead. The distinction mattered. A week earlier, he would have treated uncertainty as a problem to remove. He would have ordered someone to investigate her employment history, private accounts, professional affiliations, travel records, and every person who had ever worked beside her. He still could. He chose not to. For now. At Shinsei, Simone behaved exactly as she had before. She challenged weak assumptions, returned papers covered in restrained corrections, ignored status whenever status tried to substitute itself for competence. Nothing in her behavior suggested she knew she had triggered suspicion. That made Renji more cautious, not less. The first real change came from someone else. Near the end of an evening seminar, an administrator entered with updated accreditation forms and placed one beside Renji. The woman glanced at him and said quietly, "Kurose-sama, the dean asked that you—" She stopped. Simone looked up. The administrator corrected herself too late. "Mr. Kurose." Renji signed the form. Simone said nothing until class ended. Then she watched him leave through a corridor, normally closed to students. A security officer opened the access door without asking for identification. Outside, 3 men in dark suits were waiting. They did not approach Renji. They simply moved when he moved. Simone followed him into the corridor. "Your family must be very concerned about attendance." Renji stopped. She pointed through the glass toward the 3 men. "Do they take notes too?" "They're not university staff." I had gathered that. He could have dismissed her. Instead, he said, "My family owns businesses that attract attention." "What kind?" "Complicated ones." That answer works better in court than in a classroom. He looked at her. She was not frightened. She was assessing him. That difference had become familiar. "You already know enough to understand why details are restricted. I know people here change their behavior when you enter a room. I know Dean Ishida checks whether you are satisfied with my teaching. I know security policies apparently stop applying to you." Her expression hardened. "And I know you used a real operational structure in an academic assignment without telling me what I was looking at." Renji did not deny it. That was the first answer. Simone understood immediately. She stepped back from him, not in fear, in anger. "You let me analyze an active organization. You analyzed a model. A model based on a real network?" "Yes. Connected to what Renji considered how little truth would still count as truth. My family operates legitimate companies and other interests that are not discussed publicly." Simone held his gaze. "You mean criminal interests?" He did not answer. He did not need to. The change in her face was smaller than he expected. No panic, no fascination, only calculation followed by something close to disgust. "You should have told me." "I couldn't." "No, you chose not to." That distinction landed cleanly. She walked back toward the seminar room. Renji followed. "Are you removing me from the course I haven't decided? You're angry. I'm professionally exposed. That can be managed." She turned. By whom? The question stopped him. She understood more about his world than he had expected. Not its structure, its consequences. "If you use your influence to make this disappear," she continued then, "every future decision I make involving you becomes compromised." Renji said nothing. Simone gathered her files. For once, Mr. Kurose don't solve the problem. She left him standing beside the empty lecture hall. 2 days later, he returned with a financial model. No company names, no account numbers, no executive identifiers, just transaction flows spanning 6 years. Simone stared at the folder on her desk. What is this A problem? I told you not to involve me further. You told me not to use influence to solve your problem. That was not an invitation to create a new one. Renji slid the folder closer. A regional director tried to exploit our logistics structure. The review that followed found money moving through consulting contracts and research partnerships. Some connect to Shinsei. That changed her attention, not enough to make her open the file immediately. Why bring it to me? Because my financial advisors approved the systems that failed to detect it, and you trust me. No. The answer came quickly. Simone looked at him. Renji added, but you saw the first weakness before they did. That was not trust. It was respect. For the moment, it was enough. She opened the folder. For nearly 20 minutes, she said nothing. Renji sat across from her while she moved between pages, returning repeatedly to older transaction structures, rather than the recent transfers that had prompted the investigation. Then, her finger stopped. This architecture, what about it? Who built it? External consultants originally? Which firm? I don't know. She turned several pages. Mercury architecture. Renji's attention narrowed. Simone had already moved to the next diagram. He did not. Say that again. She looked up. Mercury architecture. That name hasn't been used internally in years. A pause. Not long. Long enough. Simone closed the folder halfway. I've seen similar compliance systems. Where in consulting work. Which company? That isn't relevant. It became relevant when you named a system you were never told existed. Her fingers remained on the folder. Renji could see the decision being made. Not whether to lie. How much truth to release. I worked around financial risk systems before academia. That is not an answer. It is the answer you're getting. He could have pushed. Instead, he stood. Keep the file. Simone looked surprised. You're leaving it with me. It's sanitized. That doesn't make it harmless. No. He reached the door. If you decide not to continue, destroy it. She looked down at the pages. And if I continue, call me. Renji left. That evening, Simone did not destroy the file. She found the first repeated irregularity at 10:17, the second before midnight. By 1 a.m, she had 6. All were small. Timing discrepancies, versioning inconsistencies, approval sequences that seemed meaningless beside the much larger transfers, but they repeated. Exactly as the markings on Renji's original assignment had repeated. The following afternoon, she summoned him to her office. No greeting. She turned the monitor toward him. These transfers are not simply theft. Renji studied the screen. What are they? Someone is using legitimate structures to make movement look ordinary when viewed one transaction at a time. Through Shinsei. Some of it. She highlighted several research foundations and consulting entities. These organizations are acting like buffers. Renji recognized 2 names. One was connected to a foundation Professor Ishida regularly promoted. The other had appeared in internal reports associated with Takeshi Sagusa. Sagusa was not merely another senior Kurose executive. He controlled much of the syndicate's financial machinery and had enough council support to challenge Renji if the succession stalled. Renji looked at Simone. How much do you know about our structure? Less than you think. More than you should. Both can be true. For the first time, there was no academic hierarchy between them. No professor and student. Only 2 people looking at the same dangerous pattern from opposite sides. Later that week, Renji observed Simone refuse a consulting offer from a major technology firm after discovering the company wanted her name attached to an oversight board with no real authority. They were offering you a lot, he said after the representative left. They were buying legitimacy. You could have taken the money and criticized them anyway. They could have removed me. Renji considered that. Simone noticed. That surprised you? No, it did. He gave her a look she had begun recognizing as the closest he came to conceding a point. The exchange should have been insignificant. It was not. She had now seen him choose not to intimidate her when he could. He had seen her reject influence when accepting it would have been easier. Something resembling trust had not formed yet. But the conditions for it had. Then both investigations moved at once. Simone requested administrative records showing how she had been assigned to the executive program. Her transfer had not been routine. Professor Ishida had personally requested her placement. Renji, working separately, obtained notes from the Kurose succession discussions. The proposal requiring him to study at Shinsei had also come through Ishida. Simone called Renji that evening. He arrived without the 3 men who normally waited outside. She noticed. He did not explain. She placed 2 documents beside each other. One showed her transfer authorization. The other showed Ishida's role in Renji's enrollment requirement. They studied the dates. Simone had been moved into the program before the council officially voted on Renji's academic condition. Renji looked at her. Ishida knew where I would be before the decision was supposedly made. And he made sure I was already there. The money trail connecting Shinsei to Kurose interests no longer looked like background corruption. Someone had designed proximity. Renji opened another file. Several of the university contracts tied to the suspicious transfers were linked indirectly to companies favored by Sagusa. Simone read the names once. Then again, the question that had brought them together had changed completely. It was no longer how Simone knew Mercury architecture. It was why someone had deliberately placed the future Kurose leader in the classroom of the one professor capable of recognizing it. The first mistake Renji made was assuming that because Simone had agreed to continue, she had agreed to be protected. She had not. For 3 weeks, they worked around Shinsei's normal schedule, some nights in her office, some in an empty conference room reserved under a university consulting code. Occasionally in one of Kurose Holdings' legitimate corporate suites, where Simone insisted on using only sanitized records. The arrangement gave them access to more information than either could have assembled alone. It also made their association visible. That mattered. The money trail had become more specific. Several consulting contracts approved through Shinsei led into foundations that later contracted with firms favored by Takeshi Sagusa. None of the transfers was large enough to attract attention by itself. Together, they formed a pattern of movement that resembled ordinary institutional spending until the dates were overlaid with changes in Kurose internal approvals. Simone kept returning to the same question. Who could alter the historical structures? Renji gave her a list of positions. She looked at it once. Too many. That is the organization. That is the problem. He leaned over the table and moved one file aside. You keep assuming the records matter more than the people approving them. They do if the people lie. And records don't. They lie differently. Renji disliked the answer because he understood it. His instincts pushed toward interrogation. Simone's pushed toward reconstruction. For once, he allowed hers to lead. That decision produced the first meaningful result. One of the suspicious university contracts had been approved within 24 hours of an internal Kurose authorization change. Another followed the same pattern. Then a third. The timing suggested coordination. Still no proof, but enough to confirm that Shinsei was not simply an innocent institution being used from outside. Someone inside the university was participating. Professor Ishida remained the obvious connection. Sagusa remained the more dangerous one. Renji wanted access to Sagusa's internal finance division. Simone refused. You walk in there, he knows exactly what you're looking for. He already knows I'm investigating. He knows you're looking at the regional breach. That is not the same thing. He will find out eventually. Then let him find out after we understand what he has hidden. Renji looked at the columns of data. You enjoy telling people with more resources not to use them. I enjoy preventing people with more resources from making expensive mistakes. That earned the smallest change in his expression. Simone noticed it. She had become better at reading what he did not say. That more than anything else made the work dangerous. The same was true in reverse. Renji had begun to recognize when Simone was avoiding a subject. Her employment history was one of them. He had asked one of his analysts to verify the firms listed on her public record. Nothing beyond what was available through ordinary professional databases. No private intrusion, no pressure. He told himself the distinction mattered. It did. The result arrived the following morning. 7 years earlier, Simone had worked at Helix Strategic Systems. The name meant nothing to Renji. The dates did. Her tenure overlapped almost exactly with the period when Mercury architecture was first introduced into Kurose-related corporate compliance systems. He printed the record, carried it to her office, then left it in his folder. He did not ask. Simone noticed. You came here for something else. I came for the Ishida contracts. No? She closed the file in front of her. What did you find Renji considered lying? Instead, he placed the Helix profile on the desk. Simone looked at it. No visible shock. Only a pause. You investigated me. I verified public records. That sounds like something your lawyers taught you to say. It is still true. She read the page again. You want to know whether Helix had anything to do with Mercury? Yes, and I am asking. Simone lifted her eyes. The difference was not lost on her. A month earlier, Renji would have treated the answer as something he was entitled to obtain. Now he was giving her the choice to refuse. Yes, she said. One word, not enough. Renji waited. I worked around compliance architecture there. Did you work on Mercury? That question can wait. For what? Until I know why someone is still using it. He could have pushed harder. He did not. The restraint changed something between them. Not trust exactly, but proof that it might be possible. Later that week, Renji saw Simone make a choice of her own. One of Shinsei's board members asked to meet privately after class. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. When Simone returned, she placed a formal consulting proposal into the recycling bin. Renji picked it up before she could stop him. The offer was substantial. Advisory fees, research funding, a 3-year appointment to a corporate ethics board. You refused this. They wanted my name attached to a structure I could not audit independently. You could have taken the money and demanded access later. They could have removed me the moment I became inconvenient. Renji folded the document. You think everyone is designing an exit? I think competent people know where the exits are. He remembered the logistics failure from his first assignment. The regional manager had not destroyed the system. He had exploited hesitation. Simone had been teaching the same lesson in different forms since the beginning. That night, Renji authorized a quiet review of employee compensation inside a Kurose subsidiary. A senior lieutenant named Fujita had been diverting pension contributions through an affiliated contractor. The old response would have been simple. Remove Fujita. Recover the money. Make the example memorable. Renji did neither. He ordered the funds restored first. Then, he reassigned control of the contractor and documented the loss internally. When Simone learned what had happened, she asked one question. Why not expose him? Because 600 employees would learn their retirement money depended on whether a criminal organization punished one man correctly. That matters to you. They work for the legitimate company. That was not my question. Renji looked at her. Yes, it was one of the few answers he had given her without qualification. Their relationship changed after that. Not dramatically. No declarations, no sudden trust, but the arguments became less performative. Simone stopped assuming every Kurose decision was made for dominance. Renji stopped interpreting every boundary she set as resistance. They began sharing more than data. That created the opening Sagusa needed. The first institutional strike came through Shinsei. Simone received formal notice that the university was reviewing whether she had accessed confidential corporate material outside authorized research procedures. The allegations were specific enough to be dangerous. Too specific. Someone knew what she and Renji were doing. The board scheduled an emergency suspension hearing. Renji read the notice once. "I can stop this." "No, they will remove you before you can answer." Then I answer. Ishida controls the process, which is exactly why you stay out of it. Renji stood beside her desk. "If they suspend you, you lose access to everything. If you interfere, I lose more than access." He ignored the warning. That afternoon, 2 Kurose-linked donors contacted senior university officials. A corporate legal representative reminded Shinsei of contractual obligations involving research funding. The hearing was postponed. The suspension disappeared from the agenda. The problem was solved in less than 6 hours. For less than 1 day. The leak appeared the following morning. Internal messages showing pressure from Kurose-affiliated entities reached journalists and several members of the faculty. By noon, Simone's name was attached to phrases like compromised oversight syndicate influence and protected academic. Her professional reputation began collapsing in public. Colleagues stopped calling. One research partner requested distance until the university investigation concluded. A conference removed her from a panel. Renji found her in the seminar room after everyone else had left. She placed the leaked emails on the desk between them. "You did this." "I stopped the suspension. You proved their accusation for them. It was false. That no longer matters. I can correct it." Simone laughed once. There was no humor in it. That is the problem. He looked at her. She continued, "You think protection is defined by whether the person survives the threat. What else should define it? Whether they still own their life afterward." Renji said nothing. "You protected my position," she said, "by making everyone believe the position belonged to you." The accusation was precise enough that he could not dismiss it. For most of his adult life, control had been the way he prevented damage. Contracts, people, information, outcomes. He had never been required to ask whether the person being protected considered the method another form of harm. Simone gathered the leaked documents. "I told you not to solve this for me. You would have been suspended. Maybe. You could have lost your career. I may lose it now." That ended the argument. Not because either had won, because both understood the cost. The next day, Simone made a decision Renji had not expected. She issued a formal statement confirming that she had been examining financial structures linked to Kurose-controlled businesses. She did not disclose the investigation. She did not absolve him. She stated only that the analysis had been undertaken independently and that no academic conclusion had been dictated by Renji or his organization. The admission protected Renji from the accusation that he had secretly manufactured or directed her work. It also placed Simone directly inside the scandal. She had chosen to absorb part of the risk rather than let him carry the accusation alone. Renji read the statement twice. Then he went to her office. "You didn't have to do that?" "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because this is no longer only your problem." For the first time, that fact sounded less like a threat than a bond. It was also exactly what made them vulnerable. Each now held information that could damage the other. Renji knew Simone had hidden more about Helix and Mercury than she admitted. Simone possessed enough financial knowledge to create serious exposure for Kurose Holdings. Neither used it. Sagusa did. The night before the succession council was due to meet, documents began circulating among senior Kurose members. Simone's Helix employment history, internal correspondence from 6 years earlier. Then, one final file, an anonymous whistleblower who had triggered the investigation that destroyed several Kurose companies had operated under the name Gray Ledger. Metadata tied the source to Helix, more specifically to Simone Mercer. Renji went to her office after midnight. No guards, no assistants, no documents between them. He placed his phone on the desk with the evidence displayed. "Were you Grey Ledger?" Simone looked at the screen. Then, at him. There was no useful lie left. Yes, everything they had chosen to protect had just become evidence against them. Renji did not accuse Simone again. He closed the office door, left the phone on the desk between them, and waited for the rest. For most of his life, people had explained themselves to him because refusing usually made things worse. Simone understood that expectation. She also understood that if she gave him only enough truth to calm him, whatever remained between them would end there. "I was Grey Ledger," she said, but not in the way Sagusa is telling it. Renji stayed standing. "Then, tell me the way it happened." 7 years earlier, Helix Strategic Systems had been hired to build compliance architecture for a cluster of logistics and investment companies. At the time, Simone had not known how deeply those companies were connected to Kurose interests. She was not senior enough to see the entire client structure. She was senior enough to help design one part of the system, Mercury. Its purpose was simple in theory. Identify suspicious movement before regulators did. Transactions that repeated too closely. Amounts that remained just below reporting thresholds. Approval chains that changed too often. Patterns that looked ordinary one by one and dangerous when placed together. Renji looked toward the folders stacked beside her monitor. "You built it. I helped build it. And 6 years later, you exposed it." No. That answer mattered. Simone pulled one of the old models onto the screen. "I exposed what someone had done to it." She showed him 2 versions of the same transaction architecture. At first, they looked identical. Then, she enlarged a section involving approval timing. A tiny decimal variation appeared in one model and not the other. Renji recognized it. One of the inconsistencies from his first paper. The circles. Yes. Simone moved to another file. When Helix updated Mercury, I started noticing that certain clients were not just avoiding detection, they were predicting it. She explained what that meant. Someone with access to Mercury's internal thresholds had learned where the system looked for irregularity. Instead of hiding transactions randomly, they structured them specifically to remain inside tolerated ranges. The compliance tool had become a guide for evasion. Simone had reported the concern internally. Helix dismissed it. The client was profitable. The transactions looked legal. No one wanted a theoretical accusation attached to a major account, so Simone changed her approach. She inserted tiny mathematical variations into later system versions. Not enough to affect function, not enough to trigger review. Just enough to identify which version had processed which transaction. She called them fracture marks. Renji stared at the screen. Fingerprints. Closer to version scars, and you never told Helix not, after they made it clear what they preferred not to know. The first clue from months earlier now made sense. Simone's insistence that anomalies should never be deleted had not been academic style. It was the principle she had used to preserve evidence. Her obsession with archived structures made sense too. She had never been looking only for theft. She had been looking for lineage. Renji sat down. What did Grey Ledger send evidence of unauthorized Mercury manipulation? To regulators. Yes. Knowing it would hit Kurose companies. I knew some of the client entities would be exposed. That investigation destroyed divisions. I know. For the first time, Simone looked away from the screen. I also know that what happened afterward was larger than what I submitted. Renji focused on that sentence. What do you mean? She opened the archive they had been reconstructing. The fracture marks created a pattern across years. Some of the earliest suspicious transactions passed through one cluster of Kurose entities. Then, just before the regulatory investigation began, the pattern shifted. Not randomly. Transactions moved into divisions controlled by men who later lost influence during the crisis. Renji recognized the names. Two had opposed Saigusa's financial expansion. One had supported another succession faction. One had controlled a transport portfolio Saigusa later absorbed. Simone said, "Someone knew the investigation was coming." Renji followed the sequence and moved exposure toward arrivals. Yes, the central betrayal changed shape in front of him. Grey Ledger had not launched a broad attack on the Kurose structure. Someone inside the structure had learned what Grey Ledger had uncovered and redirected the damage. Renji already knew who possessed the access. Saigusa, the man who had spent 6 years describing Grey Ledger as an external enemy, had used the investigation to eliminate internal competition. Renji stood again. This time, he did not pace. He went directly to the locked cabinet where he kept the historical authorization extracts he had obtained through succession privileges. Simone watched him retrieve the files. Those privileges existed because the council expected him to inherit power. Using them this way could end that inheritance. Renji knew it. He opened the oldest authorization records. Simone took the digital model. They worked separately for 20 minutes. Then, together. Her skill was identifying the fracture lineage. His was knowing where authority actually sat behind the corporate labels. A signature that looked administrative to her meant something different to him. A deputy approval, a temporary delegation, a board proxy, a regional override. He translated power. She translated evidence. The trail converged, not on one dramatic transfer, on hundreds of small ones. Saigusa's authority appeared repeatedly at the exact points where fracture-marked transactions crossed into protected channels. Simone leaned back. This is enough to show pattern, not enough to survive denial. No. Renji closed the folder. I can get the originals. Simone looked at him. If you access the full archive, he will know. He already knows. And the council, they will know too. That could cost you the vote. Renji picked up the folder. That is no longer the first problem. It was the same lesson Simone had given him in the first week. The visible problem was often smaller than the structural one behind it. The succession meeting began the next morning inside Kurose Holdings' private board facility. Saigusa arrived with support. Ishida had already distributed material questioning Simone's credibility and academic conduct. Several council members considered the Grey Ledger revelation sufficient reason to end Renji's association with her immediately. Saigusa expected Renji to defend himself. Renji did not. He requested an emergency financial review. That changed the room. One council member refused. Another demanded to know on whose authority. Mine, Renji said. You do not have final succession authority. I have provisional archive rights. Those were granted for transition. I am using them for transition. Saigusa understood first. You brought her into this. Renji did not answer. Instead, he authorized simultaneous distribution of the archived records to every voting council member. That was the irreversible choice. Kurose power had always depended on controlled access. One person knew one part. Another knew something else. Authority survived because no single room contained the whole picture. Renji destroyed that structure in one act. Copies appeared across secure terminals. Simone entered remotely through Shinsei's independent forensic system. Saigusa objected immediately. She is compromised. She was Grey Ledger. Simone answered before Renji could. Yes. The admission removed the weapon from Saigusa's hand. Then she displayed the fracture marks. She showed versions created years before the current conflict. Archived mathematical signatures, transaction lineages, timing patterns that predated her work with Renji. Saigusa called them fabricated. Renji opened the original Kurose authorization records. The signatures aligned, not once, repeatedly, across 7 years. Then Ishida's university approvals appeared in the same chain. The room stopped arguing about Simone. The problem was now internal. Saigusa tried one final defense. He claimed he had been protecting Kurose interests through aggressive financial management. Renji placed the pre-investigation transfer pattern beside the post-warning shift. You moved exposure into rival divisions after learning regulators were coming. No one interrupted. Saigusa's coalition began dissolving in real time. Not from fear, from recognition. A financial leader who stole was dangerous. A financial leader who redirected institutional destruction toward his own allies was unusable. By afternoon, Saigusa had lost control of the financial committee. His succession support was withdrawn. Ishida's contracts were referred to an independent university review. The network he had built through Shinsei could no longer function in secrecy. The central threat did not end with violence. It ended because too many people now possessed the same evidence. After the meeting, Simone found Renji alone in a side conference room. "You gave them everything. Enough. You can't put that information back under control." "I know." She studied him. That was the action she had needed to see. Not protection, not promises. He had surrendered control over information because keeping control would have preserved the system that created the betrayal. Before either could say more, a council representative entered. The succession vote had been delayed. There was still a path forward. The council would confirm Renji as chairman if he agreed to suppress portions of Simone's evidence unrelated to Saigusa. Those records implicated profitable Kurose operations that had not been part of the theft. Renji read the conditions once. Then again. The victory had given him exactly what he had wanted at the beginning: leadership. All he had to do was preserve the machinery around it. Simone said nothing. She did not tell him what to choose. For the first time, there was nothing left hidden between them that could make the decision easier. Renji folded the council's offer and placed it beside the first marked paper he still carried in his case. 3 red circles remained on the page. Months earlier, Simone had shown him how one concentrated structure could turn a single betrayal into paralysis. Now the same lesson sat in front of him at the scale of his entire inheritance. Saigusa was finished. Ishida was exposed. The threat had been broken. What remained was whether Renji would save the system that had made both men possible. Renji refused the council's offer the following morning. He did not negotiate for better terms. He did not ask Simone what she thought. That mattered. The choice had to belong to him before it could mean anything to either of them. He authorized the release of enough internal financial material to expose the criminal funding architecture that had protected large parts of the Kurose organization for years. Not everything. He still protected employee records, legitimate clients, private medical information, and ordinary workers who had no role in the syndicate's decisions. But the mechanisms that allowed criminal revenue to hide inside respectable companies were opened to outside scrutiny. Once released, they could not be taken back. The consequences arrived quickly. Several Kurose companies survived because their operations were genuinely legitimate. Others did not. Partnerships collapsed. Banks suspended facilities. Long-standing council alliances fractured when members realized the money binding them together had become evidence. The succession vote became irrelevant. There was no longer a single organization intact enough to inherit in the old sense. Renji had spent most of his adult life being prepared for a chair that now represented a structure he'd helped dismantle. He kept the surviving logistics companies, not as spoils, as responsibility. Thousands of employees still depended on them. The first thing he changed was internal authorization. No single financial office would again control the historical records Simone had taught him to read differently. Independent oversight was expensive, slower, irritating. Renji approved it anyway. Takeshi Saigusa lost control of the financial committee and every succession block tied to it. He was not dragged away in chains. That would have been simpler. His punishment was narrower, and for a man like him, worse. The people who had trusted his financial judgment stopped giving him access to anything that mattered. Without secrecy, he had no machinery left to operate. Professor Ishida lasted only slightly longer. Shinsei's internal review confirmed that he had used consulting agreements and research partnerships to move money through university structures while engineering Simone's placement and Renji's enrollment. He resigned before formal removal. The university tried to describe the affair as the misconduct of one administrator. Simone refused to let them use her to support that version. Her identity as Grey Ledger became public. For several days, commentators treated her alternately as whistleblower, conspirator, victim, and opportunist. The evidence eventually made the central truth difficult to dispute. She had exposed manipulation. Segusa had redirected the resulting damage. That did not restore her old life. Colleagues who had withdrawn from her during the scandal did not all return. One research partnership remained permanently dissolved. Shinsei offered to reinstate her with expanded authority and public support. Simone declined. Renji learned about the decision after it had already been made. He found her packing books into boxes in the office, where he had first brought her the sanitized financial model. "You're leaving." "Yes. London, maybe." He looked at the half-empty shelves. "Shinsei offered you your position back. They offered me a version of it that would photograph well. You could force better terms." Simone gave him a familiar look. "I thought we had covered this." He almost smiled. "Almost." "Right. Not everything is improved by leverage. That lesson cost you an empire. It was not an empire worth the price." She stopped packing. There was no investigation left to complete, no council meeting, no immediate threat forcing them into the same room. For the first time, staying connected would require a separate decision. Simone sat on the edge of the desk. "What happens to you now? I rebuild what can survive legally. And the rest? Gone." "You say that easily. I don't feel it easily." That was enough. Renji had not lost only power. He had lost the identity built around receiving it. For years, every sacrifice had been justified by succession. Every compromise had been explained as preparation. Now there would be no final chair proving that those choices had been necessary. Simone understood that better than he expected. "You could have taken their offer," she said. "Yes. Why didn't you?" Renji looked toward the window, because Segusa was not the only problem. The answer completed something that had begun with 3 red circles on a university paper. The structure itself had rewarded secrecy, concentrated authority, and delayed accountability. Removing one corrupt man while preserving the system would only create space for another. Simone nodded. No praise, he appreciated that. "And you?" he asked. "I've been offered funding for an independent institute in London, Tokyo." That surprised him. She continued before he could respond. "Governance, institutional corruption, behavioral risk, the usual ways powerful people convince themselves they are exceptions. That sounds hostile." "It will be." "Good." She studied him for several seconds. "I haven't accepted yet." Renji understood what she was giving him. Not permission to decide for her, information, a choice she had not hidden. Months earlier, he would have asked what she needed to stay. Money, security, space, influence. Now he asked something else. "What would make you want to accept, Simone?" Noticed the difference. "Independence, you'll have it." That was not a request. I know, he meant it. That became the final turn between them. Not a promise of safety, not protection imposed from above. Renji would not build a wall around Simone and call it care. Simone would not demand that he erase every dangerous part of himself to prove he deserved her. They chose terms neither could own alone. She accepted the institute position 2 weeks later. Renji did not fund it. He did not place Kurose security outside the building. He did not send staff to manage her schedule. He helped once when asked by explaining how certain corporate structures could hide informal control even when ownership looked dispersed. Simone used the example in her first seminar. She did not credit him. He complained afterward. "You said anonymity protects sources. You are not a source. You used my explanation. I improved your explanation." Some things survived scandal unchanged. Months later, Renji entered the institute alone. No escort waited outside. No administrator rushed forward to greet him. At reception, he was asked for identification. He provided it, then waited while the receptionist checked the enrollment list. The process took longer than he liked. He said nothing. Simone entered the lecture hall 10 minutes later. He was already sitting in the front row. On the desk lay the first paper she had returned to him at Shinsei. The page was worn now. The 3 red circles were still visible. Beside it sat a new enrollment form. Simone picked it up. Under occupation, Renji had crossed out one word: Heir. Beneath it, he had written another: Student. She looked at him. You know this course has graded assessments. I assumed. You may fail. I have experience with that. That is not what I remember. No, you remember being right. I usually do. This time he did smile. Simone took the seat beside him before the room began filling. Not in front, not behind, beside. The old Kurose structure was gone. Her old academic life was gone. Neither of them had emerged untouched. That was precisely why the choice carried weight. Power had introduced them. Secrecy had trapped them. Evidence had forced them to see each other clearly. What remained after all of that was simpler and harder. Trust was the first thing neither of them could control. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what you think really changed them.